So the first speaker is Allison Cole, and the rules of engagement are, we have a problem there, 20 minutes for the speaker, 15 for the discussant, and 10 for questions. And we shall try to bring in questions from the Zoom as much as possible. Allison.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you all for coming, and thank you to the organizers for including my paper on the conference. I'm very happy to be here. So I'll be talking about my research, the impact of the Paycheck Protection Program on particularly really small businesses. So go through a quick outline just to tell you where I'm going. So first, I'm going to talk about the PPP background, refresh everyone's memory on what that was about. Then I'll talk about my administrative data that I have on very small businesses. Then I'll go through my main results, in which I will show you that the PPP had a large positive impact on employment at very small firms, about a 7.5% increase in the 6 months following PPP, which is actually about twice as large or even larger than some of the other estimates in the literature out there that look at larger small businesses. But I'll show that it primarily worked for firms that are in less exposed industries. I'll also show that the boost to employment worked largely through preventing layoffs, so the program sort of worked as intended by preventing firms from laying people off. And then I'll do a back of the envelope calculation where I show that the per job cost of the program implied by my estimates is about $157,000 per job to preserve a job for 6 months. So background and motivation. The Paycheck Protection Program, or the PPP, was signed into law as part of the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, which we call the CARES Act, in March of 2020. So this was legislation that was put into place very quickly as soon as the pandemic arrived to the United States. About $525 billion was allocated to over 5 million small businesses from April to August of 2020. So just to put that in context, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act and TARP, which were kind of the big stimulus packages following the financial crisis, were $708 billion respectively. So it's similar in magnitude to those, but targeted specifically at just small businesses rather than kind of economy-wide and big banks like those were. Most firms with under 500 employees were eligible to apply, and studies that have looked at the SBA, the Small Business Administration's data, and other administrative data have found that take-up was really, really high, like on the order of 80 to 90%. So most small firms that were eligible for this took it up. And the really special thing about this program is that the loans are forgivable under certain conditions. So long as you use the loan to essentially pay payroll or other operating expenses, and the rules were kind of fuzzy and they changed a lot over the course of the program. But essentially the idea was to make the loan be able to be a grant so long as you used it as it was intended. So as I mentioned, this is huge in magnitude and like almost as large as some of those really, really big legislative acts during the financial crisis, but targeted only at small businesses. So the natural policy question is, did it work? And in my case particularly, did it work for the smallest businesses that were eligible for it? So I want to fit my paper into the literature. As we've already mentioned, there's a very large literature about COVID papers and about the PPP. So kind of what sets my paper apart is 3 main contributions. First is that I focus on truly small businesses. So the average firm in my data set has 14 employees and the median is 5. So I'm going to be looking at a lot smaller businesses than these other papers that have looked at PPP, using that 500 employee cutoff for identification. So a lot of papers that have administrative data, they don't know exactly who applied for PPP. So they use this 500 employee cutoff and say, everyone below the cutoff probably applied and everyone else didn't. So I can look at a lot smaller businesses than these data sets are able to. Also, I have the administrative data, so I can directly compare the applicants to non-applicants. A lot of other work on the PPP has used various identification strategies, primarily around like the banking frictions and the timing discontinuities that came along with the program. And those papers are great for looking at like the aggregate effects, particularly at specific local levels. But again, my focus is going to be at the firm level, comparing the applicants to the non-applicants. And the special thing about my data is that I know more about the hiring behavior than a lot of other data sets can see. So in each month, I can see not only how much did your employment change, but was that driven by you hiring more people or rehiring former employees or because you laid people off? Okay, so getting into the data then. My data is from a private payroll processor that's located in the American Southwest. They had approximately 400 clients as of April 2020, representing around 5,500 employees. So the clients are located in 9 states, but they are concentrated in one state. So that's going to be an important caveat of this whole analysis, is that this isn't a super geographically diverse sample. And also, most firms are in a state that was not hit particularly hard by the pandemic during the first wave. So this isn't like a New York where COVID was really, really bad in March and April of 2020. So what I have is monthly data on the wage bill, the employment, those employee turnover measures that I mentioned before, and I also know the bank that they use to process their payroll services. So the clients represent many different industries. So I'll show you the plot of the industry just so you can get a sense of the representativeness. So despite the small sample size, there is broad representation across sectors. So the green is my sample, and then the the gray is the US Census. So it is definitely overrepresented in some sectors, particularly healthcare, but it does have pretty good representation across industries. And then comparing to just other US small businesses, I have an average of about 14 employees versus about 9 in all small businesses in the United States. So I think that average in itself of like all small businesses having 9 employees sort of highlights the importance of looking at these small businesses when you're assessing the effectiveness of this program. All right, so my empirical strategy is going to be a dynamic difference in differences event study, where I regress an outcome variable Y on a PPP indicator, a time by PPP indicator, and then employment size fixed effects, industry by month fixed effects, and location by month fixed effects. So the coefficient of interest is this beta T, which traces the difference over time in firms that applied versus firms that didn't, that are within the same industry, size group, and location. So we'll talk a little bit about identification. The identifying assumption is that absent the PPP, non-applying firms would have seen similar outcomes as applying firms, conditional on these covariates that I can observe. So I'll show you some pre-trends. So these are kind of my employment measures. On the left, we just have log employment, and then it's splitting out by size. So the blue are firms that didn't apply, and the red are firms that did apply. And then on the right, we have employment growth. So we can see, at least looking in the year prior, starting in 2019, they look fairly similar on these observables. And then these are just the same plots for wages and wage growth. So obviously, this is a parallel trends assumption that I'm never going to be able to prove, but I can at least show you on the observables. They look fairly similar, and I'm controlling again for size, industry, and location. So the primary identifying variation that I'm using is kind of those banking frictions that I alluded to earlier that other papers like Granhan co-authors have looked at. So because all of these firms have different banks and have different access to banks depending on where they're located, you can kind of infer that differential access was going to at least partially drive take-up, and the rest of it can kind of be explained by like the general complexity associated with the program of why some firms applied and some didn't. Another thing that's important to note as far as like unobservables that you might be worried about in this sample is that all these firms have a payroll processor, so they're all informed when it comes to the PPP because the payroll processor is making sure they're informed and making sure that they all know that this is happening. And also they have a payroll processor who's dedicated to keeping records for them. So that should help alleviate some of these concerns about like the sophistication stories of like why some firms applied and some didn't. Okay, so I'll jump right into the results then. So this is kind of the main plot of the paper. So employment increased at applying firms immediately following the PPP on the order of about 14.5%. So that's the plot on the left showing employment. So the y-axis here is employment, which is indexed to 1 in February 2020, and then the x-axis is just counting months since the PPP. So the third is the month of PPP. So you can see up until PPP, there's no significant difference between the firms, so that kind of also helps with pre-trends and thinking that these firms are likely similar ex ante. And then 1 month after PPP, you can see employment jumps, and it stays elevated until about 5 months after when it reduces. And the average effect in that entire 5-month post period is about a 7.5% increase in employment. But there's no corresponding increase in wages. So we see a large effect on employment, but no increase in wages. And then I can show you the quickly just the average effect plot. So this is just collapsing to the pre and post period. So it's about a 7.5% increase on employment and no increase in wages. And to put this in the context of the literature, some of those other papers that I mentioned, like the Otter et al. Paper and the Hubbard and Strain paper, find estimates of about, the Otter paper is about 2 or 3% in just the month or two following, and the Hubbard and Strain is about 1%. So I'm finding effects like much larger in this sample of really small businesses. Okay, so then I'm going to jump into I mentioned that it primarily worked for firms that were in less exposed industries. So the first way that I'm going to do that is I'm going to split the sample by firms in industries with fewer or more hourly workers. So here I have the same plots for employment, but on the left is the bottom tercile of hourly workers, so firms that don't have a lot of hourly workers, and on the right is the top tercile of hourly workers. So you can think of the ones on the right as like restaurants, retail, so firms that have a lot of hourly, and the left is going to be more like information, finance, banking. So you can see in the bottom tercile of hourly workers, there's again a large effect of following PPP, about 15%, and it's about 8.5% in the entire post period. And on the right, there's no effect following the PPP. So basically, those positive effects that we see in the full sample are entirely driven by these low hourly businesses. So that kind of suggests that, it's only working for certain types of firms that have more salaried workers and fewer hourly workers, which we also know are probably firms where people are more able to work remotely. So that's kind of where I go next. And I split the sample by those who are firms that are in industries with more versus less remote workers. So on the left is the bottom half of remote workers, and on the right is the top half of remote workers. And how I'm measuring this is a measure from a paper by Papanicolaou and Schmidt, where they look at how the ability to work remotely affects labor during the early stages of the pandemic, and they're getting it from the American Time Use Survey. So they're using the American Time Use Survey at the industry level to break down like what percentage of the workforce is able to work from home. So in this case, in both samples, you still see positive effects. So for the bottom half of the remote workers, it's about a 9% increase in the entire post period. But for the top half of the remote workers, it's more than twice that. So it's like a 19% increase in the entire post period. And in this sample, so here I have the full post period for employment low remote and then employment high remote. So that's that 9 and 19. And then when you look at wages in this sample, there actually is a similar magnitude positive increase in wages for the high remote. So it seems like in the full sample and for the low remote industries, you saw employment increase, but not wages, suggesting that like pay was cut, pay or hours or some combination of. But in the high remote industries, you don't see that. Employment increased and the wages increased. So everything kind of stayed the same for those types of businesses as far as average pay per worker. Okay, so I have these two pieces of evidence, the hourly evidence and then the remote evidence that PPP worked, but kind of only in conjunction with, restrictions on your business activity and whether or not you were able to stay operating. So as a final piece of evidence to support that hypothesis, I then split out the sample by what we in the United States call, essential versus non-essential businesses. I don't know if that same terminology was used here, but essential businesses being those that, need to stay open even when we're in a public health crisis. So on the left, we have the essential businesses, and on the right, we have the non-essential businesses. So again, here we see a positive effect in both. And I'm sorry, I'm realizing now that the magnitude on these charts is a little bit deceptive, but for the essential businesses, you can see the size of the increase is much larger. It's around like 15 to 20% in the years or in the months following versus like around 10% for the non-essential businesses. So if you look at the average effect for the non-essential businesses, it's about 4% in the 5 months following, and for the essential businesses, it's about 11 or 12% in the 5 months following. So positive effects in both types, but much larger for the essential businesses. And no corresponding increase in wages for either type of business. Okay, so that's the evidence I'm going to show today for the employment effects. In the paper, I have some additional robustness checks where I kind of try to address some more of these concerns about, unobservable differences. So I repeat everything on just the balanced panel, so firms that have been in existence for longer, and then also controlling for yearly employment growth prior to the pandemic. So kind of trying to control for like is there some like underlying firm health thing that we're not seeing here that's adverse selection into the PPP, and the results are essentially unchanged. So at least as far as I can control for it, it doesn't seem like that's what's happening. Okay, so moving then to the employee turnover results that I mentioned. So I'm repeating those same regressions here, but on the for the dependent variable using the total number of hires, the number of new hires, and the number of rehires in index to 1 in February of 2020. So basically what you can see here is that there's no evidence that PPP-treated firms did more hiring, which would be this plot, or that they rehired more former employees. And I won't show this just in the interest of time, but I also do some cross-sectional regressions on like the extensive margin of these variables. So just overall in the post period, were you more likely to hire? Were you more likely to rehire? Or were you more likely to reduce employment? And I find like no evidence of any of that. So they really weren't different than other firms, than non-treated firms in as far as like how they were hiring or if they were rehiring former employees, which suggests that this program sort of worked as it was intended to by preventing layoffs. It wasn't like firms got the PPP and then they went out and hired a bunch of employees, which I think makes sense if we think about what was happening in the US for these firms at that time. Okay, so moving then in my last few minutes to the cost per job estimate. So a natural question is to know, what was the cost of this program and sort of how efficient was it in a cost per job sense. So I can calculate this by calculating the total payroll effect by multiplying my difference in difference estimate by the percentage of eligible firms and the number of employees at eligible firms. So if we think that this, let's just think about in sample for just the firms that are in my sample first, what does this imply? So my estimate for the entire 5-month period post PPP, and this time it's a little bit different because I weighted it for firm size, but it's about 8%. I had 57% of firms apply and around 5,500 employees. So this suggests that 253 jobs were preserved, while about $39.6 million went to these firms. So that suggests a cost per job of $150,000 for April to September of 2020. Or if you want to scale that up to a per year estimate, assuming it's a monthly flow, it's about $313,000 per year. And that suggests that about 12.6% of those funds went directly to the wages based on the average wage of the worker in the sample. So then if we want to be maybe a little bit more generous in assessing how the program worked, let's look at the firms that it worked the best for. So in my sample, that would be the most remote capable industries. So they had a total effect of 13.1%, which suggests that about 268 jobs were preserved at a cost of about $88,000 per job from April to September of 2020. And that suggests that almost 20% of the funds went to wages at preserved jobs. And then lastly, if we want to, make the assumption that my estimates, let's say, apply to all firms that have less than 300 employees, which is like the, kind of appropriate sample to compare to the firms that I have, then we're using the estimates from the first column again, where the treatment effect is 8%. We have about 58 million employees in the US who at firms with less than 300 employees. And so this is going to suggest a $135,000 cost per job from April to September of 2020. And that means about 20% of the funds went to wages at preserved jobs. So putting these estimates in context with the literature, the Otter et al. Paper does a similar calculation. They're only looking through May of 2020, and they find a cost of $224,000 per job as of May 2020. So if you scale that up to a yearly estimate, it's really, really high. It's over $1 million. The Fair and Sacerdote did a similar calculation for the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, and they found a cost of about $170,000 per job year. And then Earl and Brown look at just typical SBA loans that are meant to create employment, not preserve employment, so it's a little bit of a different measure. But they find about $25,000 per job year. So compared to a typical SBA loan, this looks quite expensive to preserve a job, but compared to like other estimates of specifically preserving or saving jobs, it's, on the order of magnitude, it's similar. Just grain of salt, this is not, a full-blown welfare calculation. This is a back of the envelope estimate, just looking at cost per job, and obviously it's not considering the value of preserving an employment match or the effects on aggregate demand, et cetera. So this is not, the only way to measure this. It's just kind of a way to put it in context with other estimates in the literature. Okay, so I will wrap up. In this paper, I estimate the employment effects of the PPP on very small businesses. Again, it's about a median of 5 employees in my sample. I use administrative data on which firms applied for PPP, so I know exactly who applied and who didn't. And I find that the PPP had a very large and positive effect on employment, but that it primarily worked for firms that were less exposed, namely those in industries with fewer hourly workers, industries with more remote workers, and essential businesses. And I show that the PPP worked largely through preventing layoffs, not inducing more hiring or rehiring. And the implied cost per job is fairly large, about $150,000 per job as of September of 2020, suggesting that less than 20% of funds went to the wages of preserved jobs. So that's it, and thank you for your time, and I look forward to hearing the comments from the discussant.
The discussant is Ken Okamura.
Okay, so the paper. It's an excellent paper on an important topic, the PPP. Basically, it's 793 billion to firms with fewer than 500 employees, although it turns out that actually there's a certain amount of fraud going on. So for a very large company with good relationships, the banks will perhaps overlook this for you. But this is not this paper. So this paper, actually, unlike every other paper that works on PPP, actually has underlying data. 400 firms, 5,525 employees, medium number of employees is 5, and 9 states. Data from 2019 through to September 2020. If possible, it would be nice if you could extend that a few months. I'll come to that later. I have to say it's slightly overrepresented in healthcare and social assistant, lower in retail and accommodation and food services. So, re-summarising the results, basically 1 month after the application, employment is about 14% higher. And over 5 months, it increases by 7.5%. And there is much more effect on fewer hourly workers, more ability to work from home, and essential businesses. That 8.5, 9.9, 11.6 should be compared to the 7.5. So those are the numbers. Okay. If you take the aggregated results, you've just seen this already, but I'll re-summarize it. Only 57% of firms applied. Nationally, it's estimated around 75% did. If you scale them up, it means that 3.4 million jobs were saved. And in this time period, 465 billion was disbursed. If you look at the brackets, you can see the numbers in the actual sample. So it's about 40 million. The cost per job on an annual basis is 270,000 or 71,000, 313,000 if you take the sample. It's a lot lower than the auteur number. And about 20% of the funds go to the wages of jobs preserved. So 80% goes to other stakeholders within the firm. Okay. Where are the advantages of this paper? So it doesn't rely on border effects. So a lot of the papers rely on the idea that everyone under 500 employees applies and everyone over 500 employees doesn't get the money. Obviously not true, because only 75% apply. Actually less than that apply in the sample. There's also various treatments based on the availability of the Paycheck Protection Program by county. So there was a shortfall in April that actually leads to too little money being made available. And so there's basically 10 days or 11 days when the money isn't available. And again, people study the effects of this. There are surveys that work on this. Unfortunately, they are snapshots, and they may well have composition effects. There are a couple of papers out there that rely on another provider of information on firms, the Granier et al. And the Kerfman paper, but those tend to overrepresent food service and hospitality. Okay. The issue here is that there are 117 papers on PPP on SSRN. And if you go to Google Scholar, and you actually put brackets or quotation marks around PPP, and you search for it, and you look at things only published after 2020, there are 3,000 citations in Google Scholar for PPP. There are multiple papers that are have either been published or that are forthcoming, and you can see a whole load of working papers that are clearly working towards publication. So what I'm going to try and do is go over what I think the four main strands of the debate are, or not, it's not even a debate, it's more of an analysis of what's going on in PPP. I'm going to try and find interesting things that can be taken from this paper that haven't already been done. So strand one is to talk about the effect. So Granier et al. Basically overlaps to some extent with the current paper, and they reinforce each other. They find no effect of funds going to badly hit geographies. Most benefits probably accrue to non-employee stakeholders, which is pretty much what we find. Autor finds positive effects on wages and employment, but not huge numbers. And part of the reasons for this is they are looking at the 500 cutoff. The 500 cutoff isn't a great way of doing it. There's a paper by Chetty that finds no effect on employment, and Hubbard and Strain, which is a very early paper, finds a positive effect on employment of about 1%. And there's a nice little paper by Bartik that finds that there's an increase in the probability of survival by 14 to 30 percentage points for the firm. So this is the effect stuff. And I think that the current paper is very much in this space. Then there's a second strand, which is the way in which the PPP was distributed. So basically, and again, the current paper that I'm discussing does talk about the effect of the bank distribution channel. It turns out the bank distribution channel is important. There is favoritism. Relationships matter. Who knew? And there's a lot of discussion about fintech. Again, you see this in almost all the papers, to a greater or lesser extent, talking about PPP, about the distribution channel. Okay, strand 3, there's a big literature on race. And essentially, there's a certain amount of debate about whether we can see any evidence of racial discrimination in PPP. Basically, the results suggest that there does appear to be some degree of race discrimination. I am not sure that this paper can contribute to this particular strand of the literature, so we can move on. Strand 4, fraud. I was quite hopeful about this when I found it, because I was thinking perhaps there would be evidence of fraud in the underlying data, but I suspect that most of these firms are quite well established, and most of the fraud that seems to take place is basically fake stuff. There are some really amazing numbers, though. So there's a paper in the Journal of, or forthcoming in the Journal of Banking and Finance, that finds that 25% of investment advisory firms actually fake their data for PPP, or at least they reckon that they fake their data in PPP, which I suppose isn't altogether surprising, but still. And then there's a paper by Griffin et al., which is looking for evidence that firms engaged in fraud. So they have all these flags. If we look at the numbers, fintech lenders ended up 39.3% of their loans exceeded the industry county establishment counts. 40%, which was really quite astonishing. And at 32.6, exceeded it by a factor of 2, which suggests they really did go slightly overboard. But the paper at the bottom is looking at actual fraud cases. And so there's fake payroll data, fake tax data, bogus companies, defunct companies, identity theft in the 106 cases the DOJ has actually investigated. So I did wonder whether there would be some evidence of fraud in the data, and maybe that's still a possibility. Okay, is PPP value for money? So there's a load of stuff, yes, suggesting that PPP certainly wasn't good for listed companies. 135 years of tax payments for listed firms to pay the money back, and they find some evidence of moral hazard. Lots of listed firms applied and then eventually gave it back because they were embarrassed. And we've seen these estimates before. Okay, so I would suggest that looking at the per job cost is probably a mistake. The government needed to boost aggregate demand given the shock caused by lockdowns, and that should be stay-at-home orders, not stat-at-home orders. It's not just jobs being preserved, but also increased survival rates for firms. One of the things that it's worth pointing out is that PPP is really good for long-term outcomes. There's a paper by some people at the New York Fed that looked at labour market policies. And basically their conclusion is that you should actually do something like PPP. Amusingly, if you look at the numbers, the equivalent of the PPP in their model would have cost 736 billion. It's kind of very similar to the PPP number, and it actually kind of lowers long-term unemployment. Okay, so there's a whole load of forgiveness going on. Basically, 97% of all loans were forgiven. Here are the forgiveness criteria. And basically, there was this big shift in the criteria in June. So, as I said, there is this gap in April where the money ran out. What I'm going to suggest is that perhaps the author would like to kind of take a look at who likely fails to meet the forgiveness criteria pre and post the Payment Protection Program Flexibility Act. Because to some extent, this is going to be determined by layoffs in March and April. Why is that? Well, basically, once you fire people, it's difficult to get back into the original kind of structure. And it isn't about rehiring, it's not about new hiring. And so, essentially, if you fire people in March and April, especially because when the PPP ran out in April, and then they changed the rules, maybe you are no longer going to be eligible in June. And so there are, in fact, discontinuities as a result of this. I'm wondering whether you can find some interesting things to say about who qualifies, or who would have qualified, but failed to do so. So I have this table here. Basically, the idea is that if you look at the green ones, these are the people who would have qualified beforehand, but failed to qualify ex post, and they didn't actually get to apply for the money in time. And I think that these will be quite interesting. There are also some interesting effects associated with the fact that if you have 3 employees and you get rid of one, you're down to 66%, and that is below the 75% cutoff. So if you have 3 or fewer employees, you are not allowed to fire anyone under PPP, which could actually be quite unpleasant. So here are my questions. Did the delay in April have an impact on potential beneficiaries? What are the characteristics of those who did not apply? Is it a lack of eligibility or something else? One thing that you should check is the idle advance, which is $10,000, which is an alternative that could actually be better for people who employ 1 or 2 people. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ken. A bit stressful, but done. Questions to Ken and to Allison. Yeah, Joseph.
Sorry. What's your explanation? What's the stories of why did most of these support programs were those picked up by industries less affected? I didn't quite sort of.
Sorry. It won't pick it up in the room, but it's for the online viewers.
Okay, so do you have an explanation why industry is less affected? Were you making more use of these programs? And the second question is,
how did these programs show up on the balance sheet of those firms? Is it first like a loan and then you write it off, or because in the last few minutes of today's conference we're going to show a few slides on changes in leverage ratios of different firms, and that might actually have an effect on those changes.
Allison, why don't you come back to the podium?
Sure.
Thank you, Allison. I actually have a couple of clarification questions and then some which is related to what the discussant said. So you say, the Grania et al. Work suggested most of this program benefit other stakeholders. Your effect is larger here, but at the same time, if I understood correctly, you said that only 12% of the money went to protect employment. So do you know what happened to the remaining one? So that's the first question. Mm-hmm. And then, my other point and suggestion is to look at survival rates, because the real question, if we want to come closer to, this is more of a suggestion than the question, but if we want to come closer to an evaluation of the welfare effect, the key element is going to be to think of whether this program worked in terms of avoiding turnover of workers. So, for example, I wonder whether you have employment data at the fine level that you can see whether workers are hired and fired more frequently in the business that didn't take advantage of that. So you have training cost, element of those type, and then of course the more macro question. I wonder whether you have you can say more generally whether in those areas there is a general surplus that is generated by the participation in
Should I respond?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you again, Ken, for the discussion, and thanks for the questions. Okay, so to answer the question about why do we think it was more likely take up for less exposed industries, and then in my case, the estimates find that it was also more helpful for those industries. So this is, it's a bit of speculation, I think, on my part as to why I think that is. So I think there's a lot of evidence from early, particularly Bartek and co-authors have a series of papers. They have 2 or 3 papers that are based on survey evidence of small businesses, and they're actually sample-wise more similar to my businesses. I think the paper I'm thinking of has about an average of 7 employees. And they did a lot of questions about are you going to take up PPP? Why not? What challenges are you facing? And basically they find about, I think, 30% or close to 30% of firms in that survey said that they weren't going to take it up because they were afraid that the bank or the government wouldn't actually forgive the loan. And so I think that particularly for businesses that were very exposed and knew that that they were likely going to have to reduce employment, perhaps didn't want to take it up because they were worried they weren't going to be able to follow the rules, and so then it wouldn't get forgiven. So I think, and that and kind of other, both survey evidence and anecdotal, just talks a lot about how the rules were very confusing and complex, and then they changed a lot, particularly with the Flexibility Act in June that Ken talked about. And so that evidence, and then anecdotally, in conversations with my data provider, it seemed like a lot of firms were just this is too complicated, I'm not doing this. And I think that was probably exacerbated for firms that were very hard hit by the pandemic and knew they were going to have to reduce employment. And then as far as, so that's take up, why I think it worked better for the firms that were less exposed to just because they were able to stay operational, whereas the other firms that weren't, they had to shut down or they had to, reduce employment. And so they weren't able to really take advantage of it as much, even if they did get the money. So the other question about balance sheet effects. So this has been, there's been an ongoing discussion. I'm not actually sure of academic papers that have looked at this, but in the news there's been ongoing discussion of what happens if you go bankrupt and you took PPP, and I think that's kind of an unresolved question. I mean, I'm sure it's happened, but I don't know that there's been like a resolution of exactly how it's treated. But yes, my understanding of the balance sheet effects are that you take this on and it's a loan, so it's going to show up as a loan on your balance sheet. It's a debt, that's right. And then, you know, it's before the Flexibility Act in June, it was a 2-year maturity. After the Flexibility Act, it was a 5-year maturity. And then you have, you know, a certain amount of time to pay it off once, if it doesn't get forgiven. But there is, like I think Ken said, you know, there's estimates that so far, like, close to 100% of the loans have been forgiven. So for most companies, this is going to convert into effectively a grant and then I guess be taken off the balance sheet fairly quickly.
Sorry, at what stage would be then taken off the balance sheet?
So I think...
When would one observe it turning from debt to equity, so to speak?
Yeah, so I don't think that I know the exact answer because like I said, it's the program, the rules are very confusing. But there's a covered period where that got extended. It was only 8 weeks and then it changed to 24 weeks after the Flexibility Act. So after the Flexibility Act, you were allowed to use it to cover 24 weeks of employment expenses. And then at the end of that, you either applied for forgiveness if you thought you qualified or you didn't. So I guess after those 24 weeks is when like the decision would be made about whether it was going to be forgiven or not. If Ken knows more than I do, feel free to jump in, but that's my understanding. Yeah, okay. Okay, so then the question about other stakeholders. So there's the evidence from the Grandha paper in particular, and then the Papanicolaou and Schmidt paper that I mentioned as well, that the funds seem to flow to both firms and areas that were less exposed. And then my estimate of like this 20% number is coming from basically take, you know, the number of jobs that I calculate are preserved, multiply that by the average wage in the relevant sample. So what people on average would have been paid based on that number of jobs preserved, and then compare that to the actual funds that were dispersed to the firms. And that's how I come up with that 20% number in the, you know, if you're applying it to all businesses, and then 12% in my sample. So as to like, where did the rest of the money go? It's a great question. I do not know the answer. I mean, you were allowed to use funds to pay for other things like utility and rent, as long as you were keeping with that, like 60% has to go to employment. So in theory, 40% could have gone to rent and utilities. That doesn't explain the gap, but that could be part of it. So I think that's an open question, but I don't have a good answer for that. I mean, again, other than, I guess, the caveat of like, this is a back of the envelope calculation. I don't know exactly how the money flowed from the bank to the firm to the companies. So, you know, there's plenty of room for error there, but I think like my evidence and the evidence from the other papers suggests that there is kind of like a missing component of the money that it's not entirely accounted for. And, you know, fraud, like Ken mentioned, is certainly present as well. Yeah, I think those were the main questions, but yeah, all the suggestions on kind of looking more at like longer term outcomes and survival rates, that's kind of, it's in the works. I've been talking with my data providers about, you know, can we extend the sample and get a little bit more data and see like, are those firms, especially now, you know, that it's been 2 years or a year and a half since the end of my sample. So could I see, you know, how is this like over a longer term affected outcome? And yes, that's like very important in assessing the overall effectiveness of the program and like how it worked, and rather than just this cost per job. So yeah, suggestions are well taken, and I think it's yeah, something I should do if I can get the data. We're up on time, or do you have more questions?
We have one more minute if there's an interest.
Any burning questions?
No, just about the sample, because the discussant mentioned it was like 400 firms. Or
yeah.
How representative is this?
Yeah, so I think it's definitely selected. So I want to be like very transparent about this. That we shouldn't necessarily think that this is representative of all small businesses in the U.S. But as far as the observables that I can see, it has good representation across industries. It is overrepresented in some industries, particularly healthcare and like social services, and it's a little bit underrepresented in like trade and retail, but it has representation in every sector. As far as size, it's actually, on average, it's a little bit bigger than the average small business in the US. Like in my sample, it's about an average of 14 employees versus 9 for all small businesses in the US. As far as like the wage bill level and the average wage per worker, it's like pretty comparable to the average firm in the US. Small firm, so firms with under 500 employees.
Okay, we are right on time. Thank you very much. Next speaker is Spyridon Lagaras.
I would like to thank the organizer for including the paper in the program. So it's a joint work with Matt Dennis from Carnegie Mellon and Margarita Tsutsura from Cornell. And just broadly to give you an idea of what we are doing in this paper is basically to exploit the design, the structure of the Paycheck Protection Program in the US to basically try to provide some evidence on the impact of the timing of the deployment of government capital on firms. So just to briefly motivate our analysis, so I mean it is well known that in the times of economic downturn, what it happens is that typically governments step in and provide substantial government capital to firms and individuals and households. Okay, so for example, Allison did the same thing, the same kind of motivation. During the 2008 financial crisis, the government stepped in, they enacted this kind of, like the Troubled Asset Relief Program, the TARP, in order to strengthen the financial sector, where they directly actually purchased toxic financial assets from financial corporations, right, from financial institutions. And during the pandemic, globally, around the world, governments basically stepped in and injected trillions of dollars of capital in order to be able to support businesses or individuals, and they did that using various, basically, financial policies. Okay, so the overarching objective of these programs, of these policies, is to curb the negative economic consequences of financial crisis, with, of course, the purpose to stimulate activity in the short term and basically prevent any kind of negative spillovers across sectors in the economy. So, however, when policymakers, they want to basically design, structure this kind of government, stimulus programs, they face this kind of important trade-off, right? So, on the one hand, they, a prompt and a large fiscal stimulus, it actually can provide immediate support to businesses and households. However, this comes at the expense of potentially leading to misallocation of capital. Okay, so on the other hand, a wait-and-see strategy, right, a slower reaction by the government provides flexibility. However, governments may actually not act early enough in order to be able to prevent this kind of protracted recovery. So, empirically, if you look at the data, right, empirically what has happened is that we actually observe that there is substantial variation in the timing of government policies. So even during the pandemic in the US, what happened is that the US government, the federal government, acted fast in the initial period. So basically they enacted this massive 2.3 trillion program, like the CARES Act, which was actually included this kind of paycheck protection program. But then they actually subsequently had followed up with additional stimulus program in December 2020 and March 2021. So there's substantial variation in the timing of government policies, and despite this substantial variation, there is actually limited evidence on the impact of the timing, the deployment of government capital to firms. Okay, and of course, what is the primary challenge? The primary challenge is that this kind of programs, they don't happen randomly, right? There's an endogenous response by policymakers, which basically typically involves as well selection in terms of the characteristics of the recipients, right? So we have seen it in the public discourse as well in the PPP program. Companies that they were supposed to be well connected with banks or having banking relationships, they were the first to get access to this type of programs. So there is selection into this program as well. So what we're gonna do in our paper is we will try to address basically this question empirically by trying to exploit a feature specific to the structure of the PPP program, okay? And I mean, we think that this provides some kind of certain important benefits in isolating this kind of specific timing effects, right, of the disbursement of government capital to companies. So specifically, in particular, what we're gonna do is we're gonna basically rely on this feature of the PPP, which basically was characterized by this kind of timing discontinuity, right, in the disbursement of capital. So what happened is that they have some initial amount of funds, these funds dried out, and then they have to basically reenact another kind of program in order to cover this kind of demand for funds in the period after the discontinuity, okay? And this basically time discontinuity, what it does, it creates this kind of within program variation in the timing of receiving a loan, okay? And we're able to do that, of course, because there is like information on the universe of the PPP recipients that is publicly available through a FOIA request. And importantly, in our case, we actually managed to loan the universe of the PPP loans to detailed data, basically from like detailed high frequency data from a large credit bureau. Okay, so basically which allow us to do like a couple of things, right? First, we actually create measures of financial distress using this kind of credit information from the credit bureau. We can actually follow the companies over time and look at basically their credit information. And we have actually a substantial number of, we manage actually to link a substantial number of PPP recipients to this kind of credit bureau data. Okay, so in this case, we're going to use this kind of timing discontinuity to identify specifically not the effect of the program, but the effect of of delaying access to this kind of government support. Okay, so which brings me, of course, to our research questions, which are basically these two questions. The first is, what is the effect of delays in receiving government support? Okay, on the credit outcomes of the company, the financial, on the firm's financial distress. And here specifically, actually, we're going to use this kind of, we have some information on the how financially constrained are firms ex ante, and we're going to use this information to see if this effect is amplified. And the second thing we're going to look at is we're going to try to create some measures of economic activity of firms in the long run, and we're going to try to see if a potential increase in financial distress is actually followed by a decline in economic activity of firms. Okay, and just to give you a preview of the results, what we find is that firms receiving PPP loans later become more financially distressed, and the effect is actually amplified for firms that they are already financially constrained when the shock hits, when basically the pandemic starts. Okay, the second thing that we find is that this increase in financial distress is actually followed by a decline in economic activity for firms that they receive PPP loans slightly later. And what is very important, what we find puzzling, is actually even like a 7-day delay. I'm going to show you the timing, but even short delays are actually followed by this like large economic effects. Okay, so we think, although we have no data now, so we think that this is consistent with potentially with two channels, right? One channel is this kind of business operation channel. So we need money urgently. We need money to be able to pay our employees. We need money to be able to pay our suppliers. We need money to be able to adopt this kind of technologies and able to adjust to the pandemic. But because we get the loan a week later, we basically have a huge decline in our revenues, for example. And then there is this financing channel that because I'm financial constrained, either I have to access some kind of funding that is very high cost. So for example, I'm in Pittsburgh and I was talking to some companies there. What they tried to do, they tried to do during the pandemic, because they didn't have access to this PPP funding, what they did is they actually went and asked for an advance merchant cash, which the interest, think about it as a payday loan for a company, right? And they had to pay like an interest rate of like 20-25%. Okay, so what we think it's important in this paper is like to identify that even short-term delays in funding can actually have a large effect on financial distress. It can be actually very costly for businesses, especially for small businesses. Okay, so I don't want to spend much time. What I want to say, just for because already like Allison has done some kind of introduction to the program, what is important is that the program started basically the first round on April 3rd, and by April 16, the first round of the program ends because the initial appropriation is exhausted. So then the federal government, they had to go through again the process, a process of increasing the appropriation. So there was a second appropriation, and the second round started on April 27. And this is basically what we're going to exploit, this kind of difference in the timing for our identification purposes. Okay, let me not spend time on the data, but this is actually how we motivate, when we try to write this paper. That's what we saw, and this is where we based our identification strategy, right? So the program starts, there is a huge demand in the beginning, demand increases over time, so more information comes in on how to access this funding, more companies start applying for this, for government support, and there is an increase in funding until April 15, right? Where funds basically dry out, and companies cannot access this kind of government support. Then there is this second appropriation, but it takes around 7-8 days to do that, right? So what we're going to exploit, and you can see, right, once this new funding comes in, there is an increase, a huge increase, to meet this kind of latent demand for government capital. So what we're going to basically exploit is this kind of discontinuity, and we're going to compare firms in the beginning of the second round with firms in the end, in the first round. And our identifying assumption is basically that these firms should be similar in terms of financial, characteristics or any kind of observable dimensions. And unfortunately, because we have no information on financial characteristics, we are going to try to provide you with some kind of evidence that they are at least similar in terms of industry composition. So basically here we plot the industry composition of the companies that they received funding in the 4 days before the end of the first round and the 4 days after the second round. And apart from basically this here, I don't know what it is, healthcare and social care services, they are pretty similar in terms of industry composition. And the second thing that was part of the public discourse is that companies that they access the funding earlier, they are supposed to have better banking relationships, right? So what we saw that around the funding gap, around this 4 days before and after, or 2 days before and after, we don't see any difference in the type of banks that they provided funding to these companies. So it's not perfect, but at least it's some kind of evidence that try to reassure you that these companies appear to be similar in terms of these characteristics. So quickly, in terms of credit data, what we have data from Experian, which aggregates this kind of credit information at the firm level, and we have data on credit, on payments, and legal actions for a lot of you, actually for, 5-6 millions of US firms, okay? And we're going to filter the data, and we're going to only focus on C corporations, S corporations, limited liability companies and partnerships, and we managed to actually match around 2.4 million Experian firms to this kind of PPP loan recipients, okay? And we're going to, for this, in this version of the paper, we focus on these two measures of financial distress. The first one is the extensive margin. Basically, it's an indicator variable equal to 1 if the firm is beyond terms on credit, so they are late on paying their credit. And we're going to use the intensive margin, how many days they are late, okay? I already talked what we try to do is this kind of timing discontinuity, and we compare firms just before the funding comes and just after. It's a typical difference in different specification. Okay, so the variable of interest is this variable second round, which basically identifies companies that they access PPP loans in the period after the funding gap. And we are going to basically play with the window around the funding gap. We're going to use plus minus 4 days. We're going to use plus minus 2 days to make it more of a tighter setting, the results are very similar. We use firm fixed effect just basically to avoid, like, try to do something about this kind of unobservable difference between firms that they access funding before and after, and we're gonna use this time basically fixed effects as well. Okay, just to give you our baseline table, basically baseline results, is what we find is that even like this difference, like this very short difference, this short delay in accessing this kind of PPP funding has an effect on financial distress, on firm financial distress. So looking at the extensive margin, what we find is that basically when firms, so here we actually focus on the -4+4 window around the funding gap. So firms that they receive a PPP loan in the period, in the 4 days after, like in the second round after the funding gap, they actually are experience an increase in the probability of having a late payment by almost 1 percentage point, which is basically around 5% relative to the sample mean. When we look at the intensive margin, we see like a similar increase of 5.4% in the number of days late for firms receiving loans in the second round. Okay, and we have, like, this is our baseline result, and we have a couple of robustness basically exercises. One, we use a tighter window, +2, -2. Results are very similar, it's around actually 5% again relative to the sample mean, 4 to 5%. We use a matching strategy, so we use some kind of employment information from, I don't know if you know the YTS, the NETS data, that they have basically information on employment on establishments in the US. We find very similar results. And of course, parallel trends is a difference in difference. We try to convince you here that there are no pre-treatment differences between companies that they receive loans before and after in terms of their financial, let's say, credit-like position, right? In terms of like credit score or in terms of like payment delays. Okay. Now, the second part of the paper, we try to understand some kind of heterogeneity, right? Take advantage of heterogeneity, and here we're going to exploit this kind of credit score that is available in the credit bureau data to identify companies that they were ex-ante financial constraint when they entered the pandemic. And what we see is actually there is a very large effect, particularly concentrated for firms that they were financially constrained when they enter the pandemic. So what this means is that even a short delay in accessing capital is particularly detrimental for companies that they actually need capital to be able to survive. Okay, now this is more of a, just to beef up the paper, I mean, as mentioned before, it's very unclear how easy it is to forgive the loans, like the PPP loans, but what we find is that the PPP loans received by firms later are less likely to be forgiven, and firms are less likely to receive basically government support in 2021. So it seems to have like basically detrimental effects even in access to future credit. Now, we try to basically look at the economic activity of companies, and here we're gonna use this kind of more like proxies of economic activity. One, in-store activity, so there is this kind of data aggregator that tries to measures traffic, foot traffic on companies, and we created this kind of measure of firm closure by using data from Google Maps. So we actually go to each company and we see if they're temporarily closed or they're permanently closed. And what we find is actually that the increase in financial distress is followed by a decline in economic activity. So basically we look at monthly activities, foot traffic, and we see that goes down by 1.7% and 4.6% in terms of the number of visits. And there is a higher probability, so the probability of permanently closing, it goes up by around 15% in the period for companies that they receive this kind of PPP funding later. So there is a lot of hand waving now, right? We don't know we don't have data to understand what is the actual mechanism. If it comes from like a reduction in the operations of the company, or if it comes from a financing channel. So we try to do something on the financing channel because there is this kind of public discourse that like supposedly some private creditors they were willing to forbid, like to provide like some kind of help to these companies. We don't find this happening. Actually, what we find is that if you delay, companies, financial institutions try actually to enforce legal action against companies that they are late in payments. So instead of concluding, I want to spend 30 seconds just trying to say something like about the direction of this paper, and advertise my research. So basically, we have a research agenda with my co-authors that we have a lot of, we have supported by the IRS, so we have access to the IRS data for these companies now. So we managed to convince the IRS to match these companies to actually, to match the PPP recipients to actual data on revenues, sales, employment. So we are happy to hear what are your thoughts of how to use this data in the future and expand the paper. Thank you so much.
But only 1 minute. Cláudia is the discussion.
Yes. Okay. So first of all, thanks so much for the opportunity to be here today in Oxford and to discuss this very interesting paper. So let me start. And let me start as usual by doing a very brief summary of what the paper finds and does. So basically the main research question is whether the timing or delay, and I'll come back to this timing versus delay in just a little bit, of government support affects firms. So what is the effect of delaying in providing government support to firms on financial distress? And do delays produce long-term consequences for economic activities of firms? The main finding in the paper is that firms receiving the PPP loans later will become 4.6% more likely to be financially distressed and face reductions in credit supply. And the paper also documents some real effects, some effect on economic activity, actually using very nice, I would say, novel measures also of capturing economic activity. In terms of methodology, the main methodology is basically comparing firms receiving the PPP at the beginning of the second round, just at the beginning of the second round, with the ones that received the PPP at the very end of the first round. And again, I will come back to this again. So it has sort of a flavor. It's different, but it has a bit of a flavor of a regression discontinuity, right? Because it's the ones that are just to the right to the ones that are just to the left on this timeline. And as for the overall contribution of the paper, I would say the paper helps us understanding a bit better the impact of government support and its timing. So when companies have access to this support, and to that extent, the paper takes us one step further in our understanding of these matters. Okay, so as promised, first comment is more or less conceptual, more or less about semantics and the semantics of timing versus delayed. So the word timing suggests some sort of planned intervention. For instance, the government deliberately makes available limited funds during the first round and then basically makes available some extra funds in this second round. But the fact that it's timed seems to suggest that this was probably planned. And related to this question is, well, is there any sort of advantage of having timed these two interventions, right? So to having these two rounds of making funds available to companies. So it seems that the government seems somehow to exercise this option to wait, and maybe this option to wait has some value, right? So maybe we can learn about the demand for funds. Maybe by not helping everyone at the same time, there is also some potential value to this, right? So I'm not sure if that's true or not, right? But maybe the companies that move first are the ones that are most in need of help. So delay, on the contrary, and I just checked the definition on the dictionary, is make someone or something late or slow, right? So this sort of suggests that there was some optimal time to support these firms. That did not happen, right? So there was some delay in helping these firms, and as such, we'll probably expect some negative consequences of these delay. Again, this is maybe just me being picky about the two terms, and you seem to use them as substitutes in the paper, but at least in my head, they seem to be quite different in the way we think about the problem. Okay, so maybe now something more tangible. So let me move on to the empirical strategy, and that's, I guess I just have these two main points. So the first one is semantics, and the second one is with regard to the empirical strategy. So what the paper does is, again, compare firms that receive support at the beginning of the second round, so they are treated with late help, with the ones that receive the PPP at the end of the very first round, right? So treated with early help is basically our control group. So that's just the empirical specification we have there, right? So the second round is going to be an indicator variable that is equal to 1 if the firm receives the PPP loan at the beginning of the second round. And then we have a set of fixed effects, right? So to capture firm time in heterogeneity, and also time fixed effects as well. Okay, so I was trying to plot this in a graph, right? And so on the horizontal axis, we basically just have time. And think about this as just very generally firm performance. Just pick your favorite measure. And I was thinking about 3 groups of companies and 2 rounds, okay? So the first round to happen is obviously the first round, and then later on, not too far apart, right, just a few days, we have this second round. And so we are going to have a group of firms that are never treated, that I just call the pure control. You don't look at those at all, but just for the sake of my presentation and my discussion, I just brought them in as well. And then you have the ones that have an early treatment and some that have a later treatment, right? And let's assume that there is, in fact, a significant treatment effect, right? So you would see, and this is a positive treatment effect on, let's call it performance. So you would see, right, the slope for these early treated, and the slope is even larger for these early treated than for the later treated, right? And this just happened after treatment. So what you do is you do this pre versus post round 2 treatment for early treated, and you compare this with the pre versus post round 2 treatment for the later treated, right? So you basically compare the red ones with the blue ones. That's actually quite appropriate now that I notice the red and blue. Sorry, I just got this right. However, what I want to say is that before the R2 treatment, what we already have is that the red and blue are already on different trends, right? So between R1 and R2, we are violating the parallel trends assumption. My understanding of the paper is that you're just collapsing these R1 and R2 together and saying, well, look, before R1, they are on parallel trends. But to me, it seems that you are ignoring a bit what's going on in between R1 and R2, and I'm not sure if this is negligible or not. So that was the point I wanted to raise. So, and yeah. So here, what I was wondering is why not sort of an heterogeneous treatment effect, and perhaps compare the early treated against the never treated, and the later treated again against the never treated, right? Because, and just use the timing of the treatment for the red ones as R1 and for the blue ones as R2. Because before R1, the early treated and control should be on parallel trends. Again, obviously here you would have to check. And just before R2, the blue ones and the never treated are also going to be on parallel trends. So this was some suggestion. And my second suggestion, I'm not sure if this makes sense or not, but what I was thinking is, so what about, instead of focusing on R2, just focus on R1 and think in terms of the absence of a treatment as a treatment itself, right? But then center your event in R1 as opposed to R2, because then you don't violate the parallel trends assumption. Okay, so now what I called the role of banks, which you do address to some extent, or shameless own paper promotion number 1. So I have a paper with Diana Bonfim and Cláudia Raposo, where we analyze government guarantee programs in Portugal over more than a decade. And as part of this analysis, we survey companies and we ask them, what is the selection process to these programs? And what we see is that, so on the left we have these survey results, and so the question is, who suggested to start the application process the first time your firm applied to the program? Well, at the very top comes the main bank of the firm. Okay, so banks have a very strong role in the selection of firms into the program. And just the second question just corroborates what we have in the first one. How important were the following reasons for applying to the program? And here the bank's proposal, we have 55% of the companies saying that this was important, and 22 saying that it was very important, and only 23 saying that this was not important at all. So I would just like to, and I do understand that you do what you can with this, but this is probably something that deserves some more discussion in the paper. What are the roles of banks, and how may this distort applications, and moreover, the ones that move first versus the ones that move later on. So shameless promotion number 2 has to do with the role of information. Yeah. And so we conducted an RCT in Portugal during COVID, where we provided SMEs with simplified information about the support programs available. So one being the loans program, which is to some extent similar to the one to the PPP, and another one which was called the layoff program. And what we found was that there were significant information frictions that were preventing companies to apply to these programs. So my question is, to what extent do we believe that these frictions were in place, right? And to what extent these were being alleviated as time went by, right? But there were significant differences in terms of information driving the time of access. Okay, so I'm wrapping up in a couple, in just this slide, right? So just some other comments. So for your choice of bandwidth, I was wondering, again, if you could borrow from RD literature on choosing an optimal, potentially optimal bandwidth. I understand that it's robust to 2-4 days, but maybe just tell us what could be an optimal one and show us. More specific in terms of the frequency of some of the data, so this was not extremely clear to me. Also, another idea was, to what extent is optimal for some firms just to temporarily shut down or not? So maybe some discussion here could also be interesting, and some discussion of the economic magnitudes I thought was relevant as well. So just to conclude, it's a very nice paper. It's obviously a very important question for which we still lack evidence. I take it as relevant new evidence that the time of the intervention matters, and I really found interesting the new measures of economic activity. I think that's a plus in the paper. Overall, thank you for giving me the chance to think more about these topics and promoting my own work, of course. So,
Thank you.
Thanks.
Questions? Spyridon, why don't you come back to the podium? Marco.
Okay, this is probably
Marco, other Marco.
it's probably a naive question, but can we be truly sure that the firms who got in late didn't do anything wrong, so to speak, to end up late? Where they, I imagine that they all applied together, so they applied, but were like, some snags with their application or something like that, so that, for instance, their managers could be thought to be kind of worse than the managers of the other ones? Is it truly random? Yeah, sorry.
I was wondering something similar, but a bit more about the interpretation. Okay, so you seem to be saying, look, early intervention is really important, but there is another interpretation of what you find, which is related to what Cláudia mentioned, which is suppose that these programs were overly generous, and the one that actually got into the program early on were the connected, and the one that in principle should not be subsidized. So to some extent, the one that came in later, maybe they weren't the one that needed to be targeted, and so the interpretation would be completely different. I think you can get something at this question by, rather than comparing the two, comparing with a control group, because I think that's, which is the suggestion Cláudia gave. Then the second part is, I remember, because, I think my husband runs a company and he was applying and he got into the second round. But I remember that the rules were changing all the time. It was unclear how to get it and so on. And so I wonder whether the second part of the program in some way put additional barriers, or, I don't know what happened, but, is it really the same program? So that's my two main comments.
I have my doubts about whether the second group is the same as the first group. And the reason is, you have 11 days. So those 11 days, coronavirus spreads, you have companies that become very desperate. And so the people, what you're doing is you're comparing the people at the end of the first round, who are probably less desperate than the people who actually applied at the beginning of the first round, potentially, with the people who are really desperate. They're at the front of the queue to say, we really need the money. And so in order to match this, it would be nice to do something like look at the case counts in the location of these companies to make sure that you're not actually comparing people, different groups who are exposed differently to COVID.
Go ahead. Okay, one more.
I was wondering whether you are concerned about spillover during round 1 and round 2. there is abundant evidence that when treatment is staggered and dynamic, there is scope for spillover. It can bias the estimate of the direct effect, but it can be interesting on its own as well.
Great, yeah. First of all, I was looking forward to the discussion by Cláudia. Didn't disappoint. Thank you so much. Well taken. All the comments are well taken. I really like this. I may use it because it actually strengthens our identification strategy. So what we assume is there are these two companies. They apply at the so that's an assumption, of course. That's where we get the all your comments are well taken because that's the pushback we get all the time. Are they really the same? Is there selection even in the 3 to 4 days, right? That's the pushback we get. So that's exactly the point we want to make. They are the same. We assume that they apply at the same time, and these are the unlucky ones, these are the lucky ones. And that's exactly the effect we want to actually document. This 7 days delay make this much of a difference. So that's what we try actually to do with this kind of regression, like timing discontinuity design. But it's very well taken. All your comments are well taken because that's the pushback we get, right? Are they really random? We try our best, and we're going to do more now. Hopefully, with the IRS data, we can actually see employment, we can actually see revenues, so we can see over time how these companies basically are different in terms of like this kind of financial performance once they go closer to the funding gap. So, Marco, to your point, we hope that by including this kind of firm fixed effects, we kind of take into account this kind of managerial differences. So if you assume that there are two companies, they have different managerial characteristics, that someone is better in getting a loan, someone is worse. So we hope take care of that using the fixed effect. Paul, I totally agree. Yeah, maybe we can use a control group. Then you get to the point like who applies, who doesn't apply, right? Which creates another layer of selection. We can think more about that, it's true. And that was, I agree with the overly generous point. So when we first were thinking about the paper, we were more ambitious, right? We're trying to think, what is the optimal design of a government intervention, right? So should we just give money to everyone and whatever happens, happens and we have misallocation? Or should we just have a period when we get applications and then, I think US did the first, some European countries try to do the second. Let's get application for funding and let's try to decide who is the most in need of capital. Which of course then is this trade-off that we try to document, right? Do you want to go fast and help everyone but misallocate resources? Or do you want to be slow and let companies die and make the recovery more like protracted, right? So that's something that, that's an ambitious question. I don't know what we can do about that. Maybe we need application data, maybe we need a model, I don't know. We can think more about that. And yeah, Cláudia, you're right. It's mostly of a delay, and the assumption is we apply at the same time. We are the lucky, they are the unlucky ones, something like that. And everything is well taken, I think. And for the role of banks, actually you are right. So the funny part is, when you look at the companies at -10, 9, 8, you can actually see differences that they are the more connected. And this is actually documented in the Journal of Public Economics paper that they surveyed companies. And they say in the first 4 to 5 days, they seem to be the one that they have better information or relationship, but in the end, they seem to be similar. So maybe we should make it more prominent in the paper. Well taken, thank you so much. I don't know if you have any other questions, but yeah, that's pretty much it.
Okay, we are right on time.
Great.